Well, please join me in welcoming Dr. Deborah Lando.
Thank you so much. And Bob set me up really well. Thank you. So yep, I'm the director of ecological management for the Nature Conservancy, the Maryland chapter. And my job is essentially restoration. And I've been doing this for 21 years. And I absolutely found that fire is our most powerful restoration tool. So I'm really excited to talk about it today. Let's see. Clicker. This one? Oh, the mouse.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Awesome. Thank you.
There's laser.
Perfect. Thank you. So the Nature Conservancy has been doing prescribed fire for 60 years. This is our 60th anniversary. And here's a picture of our first controlled burn. And today we joined together with government agencies, federal governments, state, county, private landowners, and indigenous communities to use prescribed fire as a restoration tool. We have preserves throughout the state of Maryland. We have them on the Eastern Shore, way up in Cecil County, and all the way in Western Maryland. And today we use fire pretty much all over the state in all these preserves. The bulk of our burning is on Maryland's Eastern Shore at our Nassawango Creek Preserve right here in Worcester and Wycomico County. Our first burn was up in Cecil County, and I'll talk a little bit about that. We've been burning there since the 90s, but now increasingly, we're burning in the Central Apps. We've really ramped up our burn program there over the last 10 years. So I'm going to talk a little bit about grasslands and what they are. And I took this slide from the Southeastern Grassland Initiative. It's a terrific source of information. I highly recommend the website. It's still in a couple of their slides. So we've got lots of different kinds of grasslands that we can talk about, and many of these are in Maryland. Bald is the only one that is probably not historically fire dependent. Those you'll find on mountaintops, and those historically were probably kept open by megafauna like bison and elk. Don't really have a lot of that anymore. We certainly have barrens, and barrens historically are that way because the serpentine rock is so high up at the surface that it's historically not really a great area for trees to grow. Over time, they can invade, but this is one of our most fire adapted habitats. We have bogs and fens. We have several of those on the Eastern Shore that we've been burning regularly, and we've had terrific response from some really interesting plants like pitcher plants. And then I want to talk some about glades and meadows. So when we talk about forests here in Maryland, I think that historically, these were really woodlands. There were clusters of large trees with large grassy openings between them. And this is what often we see as glades and meadows. And we think that regular fire sweeping through these areas is what created these large grassy areas interspersed with large mature trees, not really this continuous forest of mature trees with nothing underneath. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Marshes, we're doing some burning. Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge does a lot of marsh burning, and we're starting to pick that up. And then savannas on our Nassawango Preserve down on the lower Eastern Shore. Much of that preserve when we purchased it came with loblolly pine plantation, and we've been slowly transitioning those logs from thinnings and clear cuts and burning to more of a savanna habitat. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So why don't we have wildfires today if we have so much historically? There's lots of reasons. One is if you see a wildfire, you're going to pick up the phone and call the fire department, which is exactly what you should do. We don't want to hurt anybody. So when people see fires in Maryland, chances are somebody's going to come and put it out. But there's also, and we call that active fire exclusion, but there's also passive fire exclusion. And we just have barriers that are going to stop a wildfire. We have roads, we have homes, we have Walmarts. So when a wildfire does start, it's not really going to run across the landscape like historically it might have. And there's a way you can see that. Some people talk about it as fire compartments. So historically, if a lightning struck landed on our Nassawango Preserve here on the left, it might have raced for miles and miles and miles until it hit a natural barrier, say the Pocomoke River. But today, with so much more development, these compartments are much, much smaller. It's going to run into a road or a housing development or a building or something. So even when you do have wildfires, even if they're not put out, the compartments are so much smaller that you're just not getting these landscape scale burns anymore today. So what has that resulted in? Well, let's talk about today's forest. When I take a walk through the forest, this is kind of what I expect to see. It's kind of dark. It's pretty closed in. There's lots and lots of trees. I might see 300 trees per acre. Not a lot of herbaceous understory, maybe 20 to 40 species. If you go off trail, you're just going to hit a wall of greenbrier. And this is what I grew up expecting. But a lot of people think that this is really what we should see. When John Smith first arrived on the Eastern Shore about 400 years ago, he described these open woodlands where you could drive your horse-drawn carriage through it with big, big trees and lots of diversity and underneath. So there would maybe be 40 to 70 or 80 trees per acre, but 100 to 150 or more species in the herbaceous understory. So this is kind of what we think we're working towards. So a lot of times when I talk about fire, people get a little panicky and say, well, aren't you just going to burn up all the trees? And no, the fires that I talk about when we do prescribed fires are fast, low intensity, frequent fires. And these are the ones that we're working towards, especially at our Nasawanga Creek Preserve where we've been burning for so long. So I just want to show you a video of what a burn looks like. And this is an area that's had numerous burns over many years. This is actually in Georgia, it's not in Maryland, but it's very similar. So the fire passes through very quickly. It only has maybe 7 or 8 or 9 foot flame length, so not very intense. Very, very rapid. It burns off those fine fuels. And then what you find really quickly, this is over a span of 2 months, you get this amazing green up in the herbaceous vegetation. And this is our goal, is to get more of these grasses and forbs, just like the quail need, into these communities. And it's these regular low intensity burns that we think are really key to maintaining these grasslands. So how do you know where the grasslands were? This is where we always start, is where were they? How do we know that that's really historically what was there? It's very hard today to find that because there are reports of people who were there when settlers first moved in, and they recorded the grasslands disappearing and transitioning into woodlands in decades. In 2 or 3 decades, those grasslands were absolutely gone. So what you can do is you can look at historical maps. And this map from the 1700s shows some areas described as savanna or good pasture ground. If you're driving through Northern Virginia, there's a big old highway sign called the Plains. You'll often see areas called meadow or valley or barrens. And these are the keys that tell you that historically, you know, this area looked a lot different when people first settled and started naming them. You can also look at old surveyor reports, and this is something that we're doing right now, particularly for Western Maryland. So after the Revolutionary War, lots of the soldiers were given land grants. They were given plots of land. And in the 1700s and into the early 1800s, surveyors went out and plotted out these lands. And you can look at the surveys. And what they were doing is they were looking for a place to anchor a corner. So right here, the surveyor found a red oak, and he marked that on his survey. But some of these surveys, you look, he got a red oak, but then he did stake, 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 stake. All the corners are stakes. That means he was not finding any big trees. So that tells us that when the survey was on the ground in the 1700s, he was seeing grassland. And this is key. And we're finding very, very similar results for what we're doing right now with these same surveys from the 1700s in Western Maryland. This is a really cool study that just came out from Hanbury and Reed Noss. And it's really interesting what they did. They're looking at potential grasslands, and they modeled a combination of wind speed and topography to estimate where fires historically would have swept through these areas. Really interesting study. It just came out. I highly recommend it. But if you look at Maryland, we've got loads of potential grasslands on the Eastern Shore and really throughout Maryland, throughout the Appalachians. So the potential is there, but what is it today? Add 40% crop, 25% pasture, again, kind of what Bob said. 18% of this historic grassland is today forests developed, and only 1.5% remains of herbaceous vegetation, essentially the grassland that we're trying to restore to. So we've lost so much of it, but the potential is still there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the actual burns that we're doing. This is Pilot Serpentine Barrens. I mentioned that this is where we did our first burn. That was in 1990. They're not great pictures, but you can kind of see how these barrens, which again should be really open, are already starting to close in. There's loads of cedars that are coming into the field. This first burn was 2.5 acres. So we started pretty small, but it was very effective. So I want to show you this over time of burning at our Pilot Serpentine Barren. So the first picture is from 1992. And at that time, we were only focusing on that one glade up north. And again, we were doing little patch burns at a time. By 2005, we had that one pretty well open, and we started focusing on this other opening here. And again, you can really see from the aerial that it was starting to come up in trees. So burn after burn, we burned here about every 3 years, started getting it open. By 2013, you can see that we're really starting to punch through those forests and opening it up a bit more. And now what we're doing is we're treating those two barren openings as one unit. So now we've been burning straight through the forest and starting to create some openings there. It's hard after the trees have been established for a long time, they start to build up their own soil. And some people even come in and bulldoze that soil out. We haven't been quite that dramatic yet, but we're hoping that with continued burns, we can eventually open that back up. Oh, here's just another picture. This is what it looks like today. So this is a burn that we did just this past year. It's nice and open. And we also do a lot of burning at Soldier's Delight, very similar habitat. And they've been burning for a long time and have been doing a fantastic job of restoring those serpentine barrens. We do a lot of wetland burns. This is Dorchester Pond. This is a Delmarva Bay, and Delmarva Bays are these ephemeral wetlands. So they'll fill up with water like a pond in the fall and the winter, and then they'll draw down in the spring and summer, and essentially become prairie-like openings. And we've had a tremendous amount of success burning these. If we don't burn them, they very, very quickly come up in trees. So, and it's amazing how fast, when you burn, it's like the grasses just want to burn. And so here's just before the burn in March. This is burn day in April, and here is just by June, it's already full of grasses and sedges and wildflowers, and it's amazing. And this just really says that these are fire-adapted habitats to me. Oh, this is just another picture from a different angle of the same burn. I want to tell you a story about a different Delmarva Bay in Queen Anne's County. We have a globally rare plant, Canby's dropwort, and it's the only place that this plant occurs in the state of Maryland. When we first protected the site, it only had 2 plants. So we were really worried about this blinking out forever. There used to be a population in Delaware, but it's gone. So when I came on board in 2001, I was tasked with restoring the site. So I just went in with chainsaws and volunteers, and we just cut and cut and cut and opened it up. And we let a lot more light into the ground, and that was really effective. And the numbers did slowly start to rise. But what we found is that the other vegetation, like the maiden cane, was being more aggressive than the oxypolis and was starting to outcompete it. And additionally, we had this really thick layer of thatch building up. So there was nowhere for the seeds that are falling to germinate. But we were nervous about burning here because it's a really sensitive site, and we really didn't want to put in a fire line. There are very few invasives. We didn't want to cause disturbance. So what we did is we put together a prescribed burn plan that said that instead of putting in a physical fire line, the woods around it are very dark and damp. So when you, and obviously the grasses are open and dry. So we use that fuel transition as it goes from the open, dry meadow into the wet, dark woods as our fire break. So the prescription said that we had to come on a day, maybe 1 or 2 days after rain, and we had to do a test fire in the woods, and it had to go out. And if we met those criteria, we could burn the pond. And we did. And it was so incredibly successful. And now the population is in thousands. And we've burned a third time this past year, and in August I'll go out and see how they're doing. So I want to show you what this fire looks like. So this is me in the foreground. And so just right here in the bottom corner, you can see that shade. So that is that forest, that wet forest shading, and that's your transition zone. And you can see how well it worked. Just as that fire reaches the shade, it just goes out on its own. And that's just what we wanted. In the far, on the top, you can see one other igniter on the far side. So we only had 2 igniters. So we put very, very little fuel on this preserve. And now you've got one person going straight down the middle. So 2 on the side, 1 down the middle, and that's all it took. And the day we burned, the wetland was wet. It was damp, the sphagnum was holding water, and it just shows how the fires just pulled right across the wetland, how much this wetland wanted to burn. And we went and felt the spot with the oxypolis, and it too was damp. It had completely, entirely burned, but it protected the seeds. What cracks me up is we got one more guy who came in and put a little more fire right here because you really want to see all that green burn, but it went right out again because that fuel transition worked. And I think historically, this is what used to happen. So a few other kinds of burns. I mentioned marsh burns. This is down in Dorchester County. This burn was just southeast of Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge. And one of the things that we've been doing at the Nature Conservancy is trying to work with indigenous peoples who historically would have been burning. We feel that a lot of the burns in Maryland would have been set by Native Americans. And there's a tribe down there, the Massawawash tribe, that historically have been burning these marshes for a very, very, very long time, largely for muskrat hunting. I know that's not quail, but they're no longer able to burn because they don't have, the permits or the equipment. So the Nature Conservancy has a group called the Indigenous Peoples Fire Learning Network. And they provided equipment, Nomex. We wrote a burn plan, and we found a day in which we could burn part of the Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge with part of Fishing Bay state land and burn across their private property. And we were able to complete a burn on their property that they have been trying to do for a very, very long time. And at the bottom, they're going out to set out muskrat traps. So that was really satisfying. A cool thing about marsh burning is it also encourages the native vegetation to grow deeper roots, and that helps hold in the marsh and slows down marsh erosion. I talked a little bit about our Nassawongo Creek Preserve. This is on the Lower Eastern Shore, right in the middle of Worcester and Wicomico counties. And here we've been burning for a very long time, and we burn sometimes as much as 3,000 acres a year down here. Again, when we bought the preserve, it was largely pine plantations. So we've been slowly thinning out those pines and burning. And this isn't a great shot. I should have made it bigger. But on the left, we just burned this year. And on the right, we burned last year. And you can see how the grass component is just coming in so nicely. And on the bottom is kind of what we're aiming for. These fewer trees, we've thinned them with lots and lots of this grass underneath. And that's kind of our goal, more of a savanna opening. Sometimes we get impatient because it was a loblolly plantation for so long. We have a lot of trees, volunteers coming in. So sometimes we'll do what we call a stand replacement burn, or there's too many young pines and we don't want to wait for those pines to mature so we can harvest them out. We'll just burn that real hot, get rid of those young pines, and then accelerate the restoration process. We're also burning a lot, as I mentioned, in Western Maryland. So this is our Silent Hill Creek Preserve. And a lot of the burns that we're doing there, we have transitions. We have our woodlands, our mountainsides, and often they'll transition into a grassland. And this is, again, that habitat that Bob mentioned, that you've got both. You've got the shrubby, this foresty edge, while at the same time you've got your grasses. So we'll burn them both the same day as 2 separate units. First we'll burn the upland and then we'll burn the grassland, but we get the best kind of both worlds there. This is an example, kind of a little experiment we're doing, assisted migration, in which we decided to try planting some longleaf pines on one of our preserves on the Eastern Shore near Sharptown. And we planted this in some ag fields. And the top is before the burn and the bottom is after the burn. And an interesting thing here was kind of a bonus that we had tried to restore this field by seeding it. It had been corn and soybean for a very, very long time. It's very sandy. And most of those seedings failed. It just was turning very weedy. So we're kind of frustrated. So we're like, well, this is a good place to try this experiment. And the longleaf pines, as many of you probably know, require very frequent fire. So we've been burning this one about every other year. And the result is now the grasses in this field have come in wonderfully. They're lush and thick. And we've got this amazing diversity of grasses from this old ag field that we never expected. So this has been a tremendous bonus to us just from trying this little experiment. And the longleaf pine are also doing great. And I think that is all I have for today. So thank you.